Hello, my name is Alicia Foreman, and I'm excited to welcome you to Contract Testing Ask Me Anything this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. I work with the Pactflow team out of Melbourne, Australia, with my colleague Matt, who's also here. And today we are really excited to have a very special guest, Bedford West. He is the head of test engineering at M1 Finance. A couple of weeks ago, Matt and I had a chat with Bedford to understand his experience in rolling out contract testing with Pactflow, which he's done successfully in the last couple of months of working at M1 Finance. And today we have him here today to answer some questions in regards to that experience, which build upon the case study that we've developed. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an introduction to Bedford before we kick off with some questions. Before I jump into that, just a reminder that as we do with all of our Ask Me Anything sessions, please do provide your questions in the chat here or via Slack, Pact Slack, and we will get to those once we've tabled our starter questions. So just an introduction to Bedford. Bedford is a test engineering at M1 Finance, a personal finance platform that helps people manage their money, manage and grow their money. He formerly led the testing and engineering teams at Bench Prep, Sprout Social, and the University of Chicago Center for Data Intensive Science. He loves to participate in and follow independent game development as a hobby, and he resides in Chicago. Bedford, we're so pleased to have you today. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
And we've got Matt as well. Matt, did you want to give a quick intro of yourself too?
Sure. Matt Fellows, one of the core maintainers here at Pact, one of the Pactflow co-founders, and I guess I'm a regular face here on the AMAs now, so hopefully most of the people know who I am now. But yeah, really keen to, I guess, hear about Bedford's story and just dive a bit deeper.
Awesome. Cool. So maybe let's kick off with, first question. Bedford, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your role at M1, about the company and what your role is there.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned before, M1 Finance is a personal finance platform that helps people manage and grow their money. We're really all about providing a number of services for people to really kind of think about investing and growing their money in responsible ways and letting the technology kind of do the work for you. So we have solutions for investing, for spending, for borrowing, with some things like automation thrown in there that really help the technology do the work. For my role, I'm the head of test engineering there. So really was brought on board to just kind of kick off a test engineering function, lead the test engineering team, and grow that up. So that's what I'm doing, leading the test strategy, growing the team, all those sorts of things around just a kind of holistic test approach for the company.
Wonderful. And when we were speaking a couple of weeks ago, you were telling us about your early experiences shortly after you had joined M1 and I guess what were the early test practices that they had in place at that point?
Yeah, so before I came on board, there really wasn't a formal testing function, I would say. So we had one quality assurance engineer before I kind of rebranded it as test engineering. That was a great member of the team, actually a member of our test engineering team today, but had come over kind of from the client success side of the department. And really that one person was sort of spearheading just the initial thoughts about quality assurance and testing at M1 from the product side. So one thing that makes the company a little bit unique is we have separate departments for product and for engineering. And product has its own engineering, which is really we call it product engineering, which is kind of the front end engineering, the API, the web development and mobile development, design, all of those pieces around that. And then we have engineering, which is really more the back end engineering and the back end services. So really, the engineering team, the testing approach has not yet changed substantially other than the pieces that we'll probably get into in the AMA around contract testing and how we've used that to help out. But they've always done a pretty good job of unit testing, integration testing, really leveraging the technology. They work out of Scala to put some good checks and balances in place and to kind of take their own approach toward testing the engineering services. Whereas on the product side, we really just, we have maybe a smattering, a few unit tests here and there, a few integration tests here and there. But prior to my joining, it was really just the one, QA engineer who was kind of starting that practice before we decided to make it into a formal function.
So just for clarity, your test engineering function is within the product part of that business, and you work closely with the engineering backend group. Yep, makes sense.
That's correct. Yep.
Thanks, Bedford. So in terms of the strategy that you were looking to roll out, I guess, how did you know that contract testing was going to be that right fit for the test automation strategy you were developing?
Yeah, so I think, there are a few things that really led to making that decision or kind of arriving at that understanding. So probably one of the more substantial pieces is what we just kind of went over, which is the fact that there's an organizational separation between the product and the engineering teams. So even though we work, as closely together as we can, that the fact that there are separate departments really means, as I mentioned before, that there are different technologies in play and different models of working in play as well. So looking at the situation, when I realized that engineering had sort of their own testing in place and that we really needed to develop an approach from the product side, it became very clear that one of the key pieces of all of this was our API gateway and our GraphQL API, and how that sort of handles the communication between the front ends, the clients, and the backend services. So I knew whatever testing approach that I wanted to put in place, whatever automation that needed to be there, really needed to focus on making sure that the communication between those two departments was handled and automated as much as possible. So naturally, when I thought about that, I had some exposure to Pact and Pactflow and contract testing in general. Had just never really gotten to dug into it and leverage that. And this just seemed, when I thought about the problem at hand, it seemed like a natural first place to jump into when we're talking about communication between services and our API gateway. It just felt like that was almost in some ways the definition of contract testing and a good example of where to use it. So
great. I'm keen to hear a little bit about your experience in, I guess, that early sort of rollout phase. So contract testing and looking at Pact before you looked at Pactflow. So you did a proof of concept, right, before you kicked off. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I do, want to mention, I certainly want to make sure that I give credit where it's due. I was working very closely with our test architect. So as we built out the test engineering team, one of the key roles that I filled in was our test architect role. So Ian Pinzari is a member of our team, and really wanted to work hand in hand with him and closely with him. So I introduced the notion of Pact and contract testing to him once I realized that it was something that would be really beneficial for us and the technology stack. And as we were working together to develop a holistic kind of automation strategy, I wanted to kind of bring him into the fold for that discussion. So a lot of the early kind of pieces of what we were doing was the two of us working together to think through how we would implement this. So the two of us would have one-on-ones and working sessions together, where once I introduced the notion, we started to kind of dig through the Pact website, the documentation, and then he would take that and go start to kind of build out the proof of concept from there. So a lot of the hands-on proof of concept work, it was kind of an approach where he would take it, build out a small proof of concept, then we would huddle again, look over what he had done, review it, and talk about the next steps from there. And it was really just kind of a simple process. I think, the way the documentation exists, and when you go to the website and look at that, it makes it pretty straightforward from my perspective to just jump into it and really start, putting those pieces together and to develop it. So it was really nice because he was able to jump in and just immediately start building the POC, but also I was able to immediately understand it, both from, the work that I had done in the past, but also just cross-referencing his work with the website. So I can recall several examples as he was building out this POC where he would talk about something that he had done. And at first, I would look at it and say, was this the right decision? Are you sure you did this the right way? I'm not sure if I totally agree with that. And he would just easily be able to reference a link from the Pact website, for example, and be like, okay, great, I get it, perfect. Very easy just to see it directly in your own words with the documentation you've built out. So that made it very, very easy in some ways to come to consensus between the two of us and make those right decisions.
Interesting. I was just going to ask about the role of a test architect, and perfect timing downstairs there. I guess I'm keen to know, what is it seems to be a role that's emerging for us. We've seen a bit more of this kind of idea of a test architect, whereas maybe in the last few years, I don't think that seemed to exist. So I'm just keen to understand how that kind of role works in your organization. Is it kind of a conduit between yourself in the management function to, down, as I said, boots on the ground type thing, where the architect's designing the way the test structure is going to be set up and being, I guess, how do you guys, share that the test strategy building and what artifacts and things that are of interest to the different parties. And I suppose where I'm getting at here is like the outcomes, like who's looking at the outcomes as well. And yeah, I'd just be keen to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it was very much contextual for the environment that I was working with M1. So, I'll say I don't think that I can recall, at least in any of the prior jobs I was working in, there was a test architect role. And it was something that I knew I needed to create here for a couple of reasons. One was, I was coming on board to build the team. And although, from a technical expertise perspective, I have the expertise it would take to, build an automated stack from scratch in some ways. It's just not where I'm going to be able to focus my time and my energy and effort, right? So for me, I really need to be focused on strategy, team building. There's just a lot of decisions around. We have, agile teams that we're forming, and what does testing look like on those teams, and how do we put all of those pieces together? But I also knew that it's, critical, a huge component of what we needed to do at M1 was build out our test automation. So, being able to do those things simultaneously, to me, really called out the fact that I needed to, have someone that I could trust and delegate a lot of the responsibility of building out the automation strategy in terms of the actual hands-on implementation. So it's evolved a little bit. Like at first it was, it's always been a bit of a partnership between the two of us, but there, was a little more direction at first, where I would kind of decide on the technologies, which tools, languages, et cetera, we wanted to use, and he would provide his input. And then, at this point, he's developed so much and built so much out that he's, in a lot of ways, like he has the subject matter knowledge of our specific, implementation details. And a lot of that is, I trust him with some of those decisions now. So it's shifted a little bit over time, but that's kind of what led to that, the need for that role, basically.
That makes sense. I know we've jumped ahead past a few questions, Alicia. I'll pass back to you for a second before we go too far.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. All good. So throughout that process, keen to understand what the transition was. So from proof of concept with Pact, then looking at Pactflow, what was some of the triggers or reasons that you looked to move across to Pactflow? Yeah,
so Pactflow really came into the picture when it was time to move, sort of from a very small POC where it was just Ian and I working together, the test architect and I working together, kind of very scrappily in a way where we wanted to prove that it could work, really in that POC mode. Once we moved from that into like, okay, what does this look like in our actual, live environment when we start talking about hooking into CI/CD and bringing other stakeholders into the fold, right? So kind of the transition from like we're playing around with this, we're in a little bit of our own playground to like, okay, this needs to be a real thing that works in a real world environment for a team that's scaling, that already has a lot of development pipelines in place. And the reason for us, it made it very seamless to see the results is a pretty huge part of that. And just sort of manage sort of the aspects of like secret management, getting the token, putting those things in place, visualizing it, showing the matchup between environments, right? If you talk about like we have staging, we have production, how do those things mix together, and how do we see where we're at in terms of the consumer and the provider interaction? There's just a lot there that if you're just running something locally on your system or running things from command line, even if you're trying to hook into your CI/CD pipeline, there's just a lot missing if you don't have kind of that. I describe it as like the visualization piece and the UI UX to be able to interact with that. Even if you're capable of doing everything through scripting and through command line tooling, being able to point and click through an interface that's built in a really nice way is a very useful tool. So there's a lot there. A lot of things went into the decision. I guess I would summarize all the things I'm saying around like stakeholder management, kind of showing this to stakeholders, and then just putting the polish on it, like getting all of the glue put together in a way that where it's very nice and usable, basically.
I think I remember hearing you, if I remember correctly, it might have been someone else, but I think the trend we're hearing is like, especially with like sort of scale ups, right? You don't have the time to be spent, I wouldn't say wasting time, but, managing your own infrastructure that can be managed by somebody else. You've got so many things to do as it is, everyone's usually stretched. There's always trade-offs between who can do what. Probably don't really want to be spending that time, backing up databases, running Docker containers and scaling tools when somebody else can do that for you. I think we heard the sentiment from at least multiple customers, like we don't want to be a team building What was it? What was the saying again, Leisha? I've just gone blank. But I think it's something like we don't want to be tool builders. We want to be focused on our product, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And for me in particular, I only have the one test architect, for example, and while everyone on the team, has a level of automation capability and programming capability, the test architect's time is really valuable in the sense that he's been spearheading, multiple framework initiatives. So, contract testing's been the piece that we put in to start with, but we have a lot of other frameworks we're building out as well. And any time spent on custom rolling, a broker or something like that would have been time out of his toolbox to start working on other frameworks. So
Great.
That makes sense.
Thanks. So we have a couple of questions tabled in advance from Mike. They were through our Pact Slack channel. Before we jump to those, I just wanted to ask one more question, if you've ever just in regards to this experience and this journey. So maybe you can sort of explain what your strategy kind of looks like now. So where does contract testing fit in with all of the other components of ensuring that your platform is secure and works as you need to?
Yeah, great question. We are at the phase now where we were kind of rolling out our agile team. So before I joined, we were in this transition phase where everyone was kind of one scrappy team, and now we have a bunch of agile teams focused on different areas of the product. And we're essentially trying to develop an automation strategy that helps each of those teams sort of autonomously know what the right level of automation is to build. And contract test, because we started there, it's one of our layers of automation that's the most well thought out and proven at this point. So we've had it running, it's in the pipeline, we've caught a couple of bugs with it. Like we've pretty clearly demonstrated how to use it and how to work with it. And so we're starting actually kind of rolling it out on our teams first in terms of it. Up to this point, it's been a lot of like the test architect and myself, and we had a couple of interns, we had a few different people that were building those tests. But it really hadn't been, rolled out to each of our kind of product teams yet. So now that's in the midst of happening, along with one or two of our other frameworks that are a little more well built out, like our web automation framework and our kind of monitoring and API integration frameworks are a couple of the ones that are a little further along as well.
Great. Cool. Let's jump over to some of those questions that Mike had tabled with us in advance. Additionally, I've seen two from Jerry and Jake. Thank you for posting those on YouTube. We'll come to those shortly. So just jumping over to a question from Mike. So Mike asks, have you found that a good example to, let me start again. Have you found a good approach to adding in Pact test to an existing set of software? He says that it can be tricky, for example, if you're generating good example input-output in complicated workflows to make packs. From once there is a service that works, it's hard. Sorry, I'm not sure I understand that last bit. Let me rephrase the start of the question. Have you found a good approach to adding in Pact test to an existing set of software?
I think if I can just maybe color this as well, like, I think a question we get really often is like, there's two main use cases really with Pact. Is we're building out a brand new system from scratch, and we really buy into the consumer-driven contracts thing, and we're going to use Pact to drive that design out from the start. And there's plenty of benefits with that. But also a lot of customers and teams want to increase their test coverage, give themselves more confidence, and they're retrofitting onto existing systems. And that can be difficult. Like any kind of testing strategy, if you're having to retrofit onto existing systems, how do you go about doing that? And so Pact is not unique in that problem, but there's unique things to Pact that I think are interesting. And I think that's what Mike's getting at here. So yeah, really keen to hear how you've done that, I guess, Bedford. And also if you have also, done any of this with sort of greenfield systems and being able to compare those approaches.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I think everything you said there about the two use cases is accurate and makes perfect sense. And I think in some ways what we've done in M1 is a little bit backward from probably a lot of people's experience, where I was coming into most of our application had been already built out, right? So we didn't have a lot in place, and we were kind of implementing contract tests for a lot of the existing product that was already there. So a lot of what we've done actually has been this use case of implementing it for an existing set of software that's already built out. And the approach is really, I think the tricky thing there, the thing that you have to really get right is making sure that your source of truth is like the agreed upon contract is accurate for what you would expect, and that you're capturing the right contract. And that's a matter of, our approach to that's been just digging into the code and into the requests and responses themselves. So we'll, kind of go through and use the application, look at the request responses, snoop on those, and make sure that we understand what the existing request response structure and contract looks like. And then taking that and not just making assumptions about that, but I think you have to go then validate to make sure that what you're seeing is you understand why it is the way it is, so that you can build the right tests when you build out those contract tests. So from there, you kind of go in and you'll either look into the code. So in our case, we have the contract tests on the consumer side, which is the API side. They live in the API code itself, and we'll just go into that code base and look at we have service clients that are responsible for kind of the translation between the clients and the services, and making sure that they're communicating properly. So we look at that code and make sure that it looks accurate. So I think the tricky part is you can kind of, it's easy to make bad assumptions, I guess is the way I would say that. If you're going into existing code, you have to be careful about, if you're taking the approach of looking at the existing request responses, you really need to ideally understand why the requests and responses are what they are, and that you're not covering up a bug of, say, it's working right now, but maybe it's only working because of two wrongs make a right. Sometimes happens with communication, I feel like, between services and clients and APIs. So that's sort of the way it's gone, and it's worked pretty well. But the neat thing is that can also work for the second use case of building out new software as well. And I can give an example. One of the bugs we found, we are actually, sort of refactoring one of our primary services, which is around the investing. So we're introducing some new use cases, things like that, and had a major refactor of one of our services related to investing. And we were building out contract tests for that, and we're actually able to use those. And our backend team, the engineering team, started running the contract tests to validate that basically our contract was supposed to remain the same. So any refactoring they did on the engineering side should not have affected the contract, which is perfect. So we have the contract tests in place. They're doing some refactoring, and they were actually able to run those contract tests to make sure they didn't break anything. So even though we built them for existing functionality, it was very useful for the use case of now we're introducing new functionality that's actually a major overhaul. Perfect use case for making sure we cover that without breaking the existing contracts.
Yeah, it's a good one. And we also get, I guess, a variation of that is kind of the monolith to microservice migration, where they're being moved from one system to another, or in fact, any kind of movement or migration. Because if the interface needs to stay the same, if you've got the contract in place, you can make that movement. Doesn't matter where the software is now, because you've kind of got that confidence. Yeah, good one. So I think just moving on to another question, I guess it kind of relates into this. Mike asked the question, have you managed to, I think there's a couple of questions here, basically around measurement and how you're seeing the value. And, I appreciate, I guess, still early in the journey in the grand scheme of things relative to some of our customers, but I'll put this question up. So the first one was, have you managed to, impact the time spent running other types of tests? So reducing, your end-to-end tests or manual tests in this case, or increasing stability. And there's a few similar comments sort of coming through from Jake around what metrics have you got to measure the test coverage, and similarly, are you? I guess what we do also get is questions like, well, how do you give us coverage maps and whatnot? And coverage is difficult because the way Pact works is the coverage is from the consumer's perspective. And I think this is something that people get hung up on is we want the provider coverage, but actually that doesn't matter. What matters is what the consumer does. And it only matters that you cover that. But there is a challenge with Pact is because you're looking at the consumer, only what is written by its tests, you need to find out what it hasn't done. And so it's kind of a bit of it's not an unknown, but it's a known unknown potentially. So I guess there's a few things for you. How are you measuring success? How are you measuring the progress of your rollout?
Yeah, definitely. So, definitely preface it with it's still early for us. And, from that perspective, I would say in terms of measurable benefit, one of the biggest benefits is almost like time to market in a way, where I would say what leveraging contract tests has done for us is it's enabled us to build a lot of automation coverage more quickly and more effectively than we would have if we started with end-to-end tests, for example. And I actually had this discussion with my boss, with our VP of product now, about he asked the question, like, why are we not starting with end-to-end automation tests? It seems like you get a lot of coverage that way, like very quickly. And I explained to him like the difficulty, and there's some truth in that, but it's also very easy to write brittle tests that are very flaky with end-to-end testing. And it also can potentially like take a long time to write those effectively to make sure that they're stable and to make sure that you're doing the right thing there. And we talked about the test pyramid and all those sorts of pieces of it. And when I talked about the fact that we can leverage contract testing, and really, it's basically unit testing, and it's very easy to write very stable, quick tests with contract testing that in some ways give you a very high degree of confidence around your coverage as well, because you have very clear areas that you're testing. The contracts themselves are written in a way that you can understand what you're covering, right? And it just gives you a lot of confidence very quickly. So the benefit, it's less about, have we spent less time running end-to-end tests or anything like that. For us, it's about how long it's taken us to roll things out and how we've been able to adapt our automation approach. So I think if we didn't have Pact and if we didn't have contract testing in place, I would have had to have really thought about the layers of automation we were building and where we needed to start and invest in. And I think we would have had to have spent a lot more time getting things going and preventing bugs, because we really would have had to thought about not just the end-to-end testing, but like how do we build out our mock framework earlier with our UI tests and our API integration tests, which can also be a little bit flakier. So it's almost like time to market in the sense of if we think about the automation framework as our tool that we're developing and our internal developers as the customers, time to market to get that out the door has been greatly reduced. The other piece of that around measuring coverage, one piece of our automation approach is actually around the idea of like behavior driven development and tracking. We're trying to leverage Gherkin and Cucumber. And I think actually contract testing plays really well with this, because the idea of coverage is like, from our perspective, we want to test the things that are actually in use by our customers. And so we want to develop an approach where we start with kind of the Gherkin use cases. It's for anyone who's not familiar, it's the like given when then sort of user story-esque format of writing down use cases. And we're trying to derive our automation from there. Now we don't have this fully hooked up yet, but the nice thing is like contract testing really plays well with that, because to your point, Matt, it's all about you're testing the things that matter from the consumer's perspective. And the consumer in our case is, how we're currently using it is the API gateway, which is sort of the eyes that our clients, see through in a lot of ways. So what we're trying to do is leverage that. Once we get to the piece where we really need to start tracking coverage and explaining coverage, leverage that through our kind of Gherkin scenarios, which are derived from our product managers and the use cases they write, and working with test engineers to make sure that we write that in a sort of automatable way. So.
Awesome. Maybe just one more, given that we're running out of time. So thanks for the questions online. I think, Jake, it sounds like Bedford's kind of answered probably the when to build type things. I'll link to an AMA where we covered those differences as well. I suppose last thing is just kind of, I think there's a couple of questions, one around kind of onboarding and how you're managing, the team. And the previous question was probably around, I guess it's kind of that initial rollout and how you're bringing people into that process. And maybe that's not a bad way of just framing that last question. Maybe if you can sort of keep it short and punchy, how do you think about bringing new people into the team, and what does that onboarding process look like?
Yeah, it's really all about just clear documentation for us and examples of running the contract test. So we have Confluence that we leverage, and we just put up a couple of quick guides on here's where the consumer tests live, here's where the provider tests live, here's how you run them, and then here's how you troubleshoot. So one thing that was a little bit tricky was if there are issues between like publishing the contracts, for example, making sure those are in sync. Then we just develop a really quick guide, run this from the provider tests, side of the house if you need to get things back in sync. And that's really all there is to it. We just have kind of quick guides, and we communicate that out, and then we just explain the benefit as well, which again, the documentation you have in place makes that very easy. So in a lot of cases, it's like, here's the benefit, but also like go read this from the Pact website if you need to, which makes it nice and simple.
It sounds good. We know a lot of customers set up like a community of practice that, especially early on, just to keep the knowledge moving. And while the company and the organization is working out how contract testing, works for you, and over time that stabilizes. I will ask one more question, and I'll try and go for a yes or no if possible. Are you using Can I Deploy?
Yes.
And are you using it as a final gate, or is it sort of built in with other gates to say, the combination of these things means we can release? Or is it sort of literally that last gate before you do release?
It is the last gate. We have temporarily stopped it just to make sure that we have a good grasp on things, but it is the last gate that we're using now.
Awesome. I think that probably helps answer that last question from Mike. So very, very, very cool. I will hand back to Alicia. Thank you so much, Bedford. That was really cool.
Thank you, Matt. Bedford, thank you so much for your time. It's really wonderful to chat to you again. We really appreciate you sharing your experience, and I think great to have Jerry and Jake asking some questions, and Mike as well. Please, we know that you're over in the Pact Slack group, so I'm sure you wouldn't mind if people do get in touch with any additional questions. Thank you to everyone who has attended today and those who are watching this after as the recording. We're really pleased that we've had Bedford here to speak about his experience in rolling out Pactflow and contract testing at M1 Finance. Please join us for our next AMA. We will announce that soon. That will be in October. Bedford, have a wonderful rest of your afternoon or evening there in Chicago. And Matt, we'll catch you online shortly.
Great. Thanks, Bedford. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. And feel free, anyone, reach out if you have questions. Thank you. Bye.
Awesome.